Hi there, everybody. Mr. Chris here. So, when I was growing up, I spent I would say, about 125% of my time listening to Adventures in Odyssey. And I memorized pretty much every episode from like the very beginning all the way up to like the Andromeda series. And I got some personal favorites such as Aloha Oe, which is a three-part series in which the Barkley family goes to Hawaii with the Rathbone family. And one of the last ones that I listened to about a year ago with some friends who I was traveling with was a 2 or 3 part series called Camp Horanut, in which a kid named Donnie tells about his experiences at Camp Horanut in his journal, and then reflects on what happened and tells you what kind of lessons he learned from that. And I was really struck by how similar that is to what we're going to be learning about today in writing a personal essay. So, before we get to the personal essay, let's take a look at what your assignments are going to be for today. So first off, what are the assignments that are due today, which is Friday, April the 17th? What is due today in grammar is the following, pages 176 to 178. In your literature, you are turning in numbers 1, 3, and 5 from Romeo and Juliet. And in your VSP, you are turning in the list 25 vocab words and definitions written one time, and also the list 25 exercises A and B. Now, just a quick note here. You also should have taken Evangeline Quiz 4 back on Wednesday. That was due by 3 o'clock on Wednesday. Okay, now, what is going to be assigned today? Today, we are assigning the following. You're going to be doing writing the first draft of a personal essay that I'll be detailing in just a couple of minutes. And then you're also going to be taking a test in literature. So that lit test is going to be due at 3 o'clock. In VSP, you'll be taking a quiz 25, also due by 3 o'clock on Friday. And then your homework for VSP is going to be to write list 26 spelling words 5 times. Now, if you have not taken or you probably have not, taken your Lit Test 10 and your VSP Quiz 25, and so I posted links to some Quizlet flashcard sets that will be extremely helpful to get you ready for that test and that quiz. So make sure you use those. Now, one note yet about Lit Test 10. So a big part of that test is going to be writing a short essay, I think it's one or two or maybe 3 paragraphs. I think 1 or 2 paragraphs that summarizes the nature of Evangeline's relationship with her fiance and how that they were separated and then also found each other again. And so if you are at all shaky with some of those details, like, well, if you're thinking Evangeline was separated from her fiance, well, you probably missed the point entirely. It's like you have to comprehend the significance of Evangeline being separated from her fiance and then being reunited with her fiance and the struggle in between those two things happening to be able to answer this question. So just make sure you understand the gist of the story. Okay, let us get to our grammar for today. So would you please go with me in your grammar book to page 179. Personal essay. More informal in nature, the personal essay uses first person narrative to convey a main point. What is first person? It means I, me, and my. So that's the first person. I'm talking right now about my perspective. I'm talking in the first person. You will incorporate what you have learned about writing good paragraphs and interesting descriptions by using, number 1, descriptive details, which allow the reader to see the action, 2, dialogue, which permits the reader to hear the character's conversation, and 3, exposition, which explains the relationship of events in the story. Okay, let's go to step 1. Select and limit the subject by listing your ideas. Now, these ideas have to be about your life, and they have to be some sort of story, something interesting that has happened to you that has taught you a lesson. Now, you might be thinking, a story from my life. My life is boring, and I'm going to tell you this. No, it's not. You don't have to have extremely exciting things happen to you for your stories to be interesting. Let me illustrate that in 3 ways. Number 1, the other day, I logged into the Book of Faces, Facebook, and there was a friend of mine whose name is Alexei, and he's a dentist who lives in, I think, Toronto or Montreal, Canada. Now, he posted a video that, on its face, seemed extremely boring. But because all it actually was him driving his car down the crowded, busy streets of Toronto or Montreal with a really interesting song playing in the background. That was it. And when it began, when the video started, I thought, I wonder where this is going. Maybe there's going to be an accident or something. But nope, all it was just him driving through the streets. That's all it was. And I watched the whole thing to the end, even after I realized that there was nothing going to happen here except him navigating the car through the streets of Montreal or Toronto. But I watched it anyway. Now, why on earth did I watch that? Well, number one, it was interesting because the song was interesting. And number two, it was interesting because it really just detailed something that he does every single day, but in a different way than I do it. I also get into my car and drive somewhere. And possibly, if I would turn my camera on and show the beautiful scenery that I'm driving through on my way to school every day, there might be a lot of people who would actually watch that because they might be thinking, wow, Oregon's such a beautiful place to live. And in my case, I was watching this really boring thing that he was doing, driving his car around the streets. But to me, it was fascinating because I was seeing things in a completely different perspective, driving through a busy city. So something doesn't have to be extremely exciting to be interesting. Okay, number two, I have an Aunt Ruth. And Aunt Ruth lived in Kiev, Ukraine for a while with her husband and family. And she would write a journal and send that out to anybody who was interested in it. And so about every Friday or Saturday night, we would receive a fax. Yes, a fax. From my Aunt Ruth, and it would detail the things that had happened over the last week. Now, my mom and dad often read it out loud, and I often found it very interesting. I was like 10, 11, 12 or so at the time, and so I often would listen to them, to my mom or my dad read that, and it was very, very interesting. Now, it wasn't that my Aunt Ruth was leading a highly interesting life. Not really. The thing was that she was really good at digging little bits of gold out of the boring things that happened in life. She'd talk about how that the kids did this, the kids did that, how they had popcorn with whoever this was, and she was able to draw out these little details that were things that I dealt with too, that our family saw too, but somehow she was able to tell them in a way that was really interesting. So you don't have to do exciting things to be interesting. And then I've got one more thing. So, as you know, I am studying history. I'm almost finished studying history at Liberty University. And I've noticed something really intriguing about studying history. And that is that, from studying and teaching history, and that is this, that the more generally you talk about the exciting things that happen in history, the more boring it is to students. But the more you drill down into what seems like boring details, the more exciting it becomes to students. So watch this. So I could talk to you for hours about the Civil War. And we could talk about the causes of the Civil War. We could talk about the major events during the Civil War. We could talk about the political leaders during the Civil War. We could talk about the aftermath of the Civil War. We could talk all about the Civil War. And by the time I'd be done, you might be so bored with the Civil War because it's all just these big ideas and it's just like, whatever. But if I could tell you stories directly from the camps that these Civil War soldiers lived in and tell you exactly what kinds of jokes they liked to play on each other while they were in the camps, then you'd be interested. Why? Have you ever experienced a Civil War? Wouldn't you rather know about the big, exciting, overarching things? Or would you rather know about the kinds of practical jokes that the soldiers played on each other while they were waiting in the camp? You probably are going to say, yeah, kind of rather hear about the practical jokes. Of course you would, because we're humans. And finally, when we drill all the way down to the boring details that are on the ground, right, that's where things get interesting. And the same thing is true for you. You don't have to have a big, exciting event take place to be interesting. All right, so I think I've made my point now in 3 different ways. So let's take a look. Step 1. Select and limit the subject by listing your ideas. So I think we've talked about this before. Everyone is either a lister or a Weber. And so set yourself a timer for 5 minutes and brainstorm. List or web different ideas about things that have made an impact on you. Now, there are 5 really good questions for you to ponder here. Number 1, have you ever done something you instantly regretted? If you did, it probably would lead to a great story. 2, have you experienced something that had a lasting effect on you? If you did, it probably would lead to a great story. 3, is there a daily routine that has taught you a lesson? Probably less exciting for sure, but could lead to a good story. 4, have you had an experience that caused you to change your attitude toward a particular person, place, thing, or idea? If you did, probably would lead to a good story. And 5, have you had an experience that promoted a positive character trait such as determination, punctuality, or honesty? Okay, so these are all great questions to ask as you ponder something that has happened to you that could lead to a good lesson, a good story. Now, we're going to ignore B here, which says, although personal experiences work best, you may write a narrative based on someone else's experience or an event you witnessed. I'm just going to knock that one out and say, no, you may not do that. Okay, let's go on to step 2. Now, let's assume that you have already done your brainstorming. You have an idea, something that happened to you that you're going to be using. So let's now write a thesis. The personal essay comes to one point, a definite lesson that you learned. It says, here is an experience or thought which has seemed sensible or illuminating to me. I want to share it with others. And so here's an example. I had no idea how God was going to use this week to reveal himself to me. Let me give you another example. So back to Camp Whatanut, the story about Donnie going to camp in the Adventures in Odyssey world. So there is an overall lesson that Donnie learns, and as he recounts different parts of his story there at Camp Whatanut, he keeps on developing this particular lesson. So the way things are kicked off is Donnie keeps getting made fun of because he's so short. And so that happens early on in the story. Some kids keep making fun of him for being short. And then even Mr. Whitaker says something that he doesn't mean to be making fun of Donnie, but it actually highlights the fact that Donnie is short. And so Donnie feels terrible about being short. And then as the week goes on, various lessons are learned. Some of them include, or as the series goes on, different lessons are learned, some of them including Donnie being short. But at the very end, Donnie is able to get himself out of a particular problem in which he and Mr. Whitaker are being chased by a bear just because he is short. He's so short and so little that he's able to climb all the way to the top of a tree to help Mr. Whitaker. He and Mr. Whitaker find their way home after they've been chased by a bear. So that is really the whole point of the story. And I haven't listened to this episode recently, but I'm going to guess that somewhere toward the beginning and then again somewhere toward the end, there's some sort of thesis that Donnie lays out, saying something like, I guess I didn't know how much I was going to learn about how the way that God made me, or something like that. And it's like this thesis is going to be the lesson that you're going to be learning, or that you have learned from your experience, right? So I'm going to give you one more example, and because as I was thinking through what I could write my personal essay on, I was thinking through the experience I had almost exactly this time of year about, let's see, it was 2006, so that would have been like 14 years ago. 14 years ago. I was working extremely hard in high school, and I ended up in the emergency room on my last day of school. It's a whole story in itself. And the lesson I learned from that was knowing your limits. Knowing your limits. And so my thesis could be something like this. I had to learn it the hard way, but I learned that everybody has limits, including myself. That could be my thesis, and then I would tell my story. Okay, so you're going to have to figure out what your thesis is, what your lesson is that you're gaining from this personal experience. Now, step 3, organize the ideas. Because the personal essay is usually a narrative story, arrange your details in chronological order. Now, this is a skill that I've noticed pretty much every student has intrinsically, meaning without even trying to. And so as pretty much as soon as kids start writing stories in like first or second grade, they start telling things in chronological order. So this is really something that you're not going to struggle to do at all. Just tell a story in chronological order. Okay, step 4, write the essay as a story from beginning to end. Now, here's where things get really important. A, follow this pattern. 3 paragraphs. Paragraph number 1 is your introduction. This is going to start with an attention getter. Begin in one or more of these ways. Describe the scene where the story takes place. Use dialogue to spark interest in the characters. Begin in the middle of the action to promote suspense. And you might be thinking, didn't you just say to tell the story in chronological order? Yes, that is absolutely true. But you can actually give a couple of sentences away at the very beginning in which you actually are somewhere in the middle of the action. So before I move on to the final example that's given here of an attention getter, I'm just going to describe to you a particular attention getter that I just heard that was extremely effective. And that is this. I like to listen to a podcast called American... forgetting all of a sudden. American Scandal. Yes, American Scandal. And I'm listening to a particular series on American Scandal right now about David Koresh and the Waco, Texas debacle that took place in like the early 90s. If you know, with a group called the Branch Davidians. Now, if you don't know anything about this, then yeah, you have something to look up. It's quite the story about David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. This is like I think maybe a 5-part series or so that this podcast is doing. And something that they did that was so super effective to get me sucked into the story was that they actually started recounting the story at the right before David Koresh and his compound of Branch Davidians come under attack by federal troops. And so it's like they started it like right there. And then they talked it, like they described that for a little bit, and then they left it and jumped way back to the beginning of the story when David Koresh was still in high school. And so that was a super effective way to get me sucked right into the story. Now, I was thinking about this. It could be because I have actually started a couple of American Scandal series and have not finished them because I just wasn't interested enough in the story. I maybe listened to one episode or two, and then I just dropped it because I didn't really care. It was just the story wasn't compelling enough. But in this, and that could have happened in this case as well, but they got me, they hooked me with that initial story that built the tension to this point where I was like, oh, I've got to find out what happens then. Like, what's going to happen? And so I've now stuck with this and have thoroughly enjoyed this series about David Koresh so far. So that's what is intended by this. So can you actually start your personal essay somewhere toward the end or somewhere where it's really exciting and then leave people hanging and go back in your story? Like that would be how you do this. Okay, so there's one more attention grabber to discuss here, and that would be to describe a main character. All right, so describe the scene, use dialogue, begin in the middle of the action, or describe a main character. And then after you've put the attention getter in there, you're going to put your thesis in there, right? So, so I'll give you one example. I'm just cooking up off the top of my head here. Going back to my own personal essay example about when I ended up in the emergency room, I could say something like this. I lay on the floor gasping for air. Help, I said. And then I could go to my thesis. I could say, I had to learn the hard way that everybody has limits. Oh, that's pretty good. And then in the next paragraph, I would jump to, let's go there. Body, paragraph number 2 is the body. Paragraph 2 and following. This could be like 2, 3, and 4. Paragraphs 2 and following. Tell the story in chronological order. Build to the climax where you reveal the narrative's main point. Okay, so what I'd do next is I would jump back to like the beginning of my senior year in high school. And I would talk about why I had to work so hard. the fact that I had lived in Ukraine for a while and I had fallen behind in my work and I had a lot of stuff to get done, and so I had to work really hard during my senior year in high school. I talk about that, and I maybe would talk about how that I was the class president in my high school, and how that I had to do a lot of work to get that done, and how that my family was going through some tough things at the time as well, and how that I was kind of on my own to get my stuff done. I was under a lot of stress, and then I would start talking about how I kept getting more and more and more desperate to get everything finished by graduation, and so I began doing this and doing that and doing all these unhealthy things, and how that all of a sudden one day that was enough, and I ended up in the emergency room. So like that's how I would develop the story toward the climax, where I ended up in the emergency room. But then I could go on to the last paragraph, the conclusion, and I would conclude the story. And the way I would conclude my story is like this. I would then flash forward to like a week after I was in the emergency room to where I walk onto the stage and I receive my diploma. And I would have learned two really good lessons. Number one is that everybody has limits, and you've got to know your limits, and you've got to stay inside those limits. But number two, I also did a lot of hard work and was able to succeed because of that hard work, and that you have to figure out a balance between working hard and knowing your limits. Like that's how I would then conclude the story, with me getting the diploma, and then I would say that. I would emphasize the message that you want to convey, which I just did, which was finding boundaries, and then also working hard and finding the trade-off between those two. Okay, that would be that's my example of a personal essay. What's yours going to be? Now, be sure to incorporate these things into your personal essay. A lot of personal pronouns, so use the I, me, my, mine, we, us, our, and ours. If the story is about you, which in your case it will be about you. And B, use third-person pronouns, he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, their, theirs, and the people's names if the story is about someone else. In your case, it's not, so just forget that. Number two, specific details. Use only those details that contribute to the one point you are trying to convey. And this is something that I am trying to learn right now, especially as I'm making these videos and I watch these videos sometimes, I listen to myself talk, and I realize that I tend to give some non-essential information. Sometimes when I'm telling stories, for sure, I give non-essential information. And so try to limit yourself as much as possible because that is going to make you more pithy and more interesting. Okay, specific actions. Show details and actions to avoid merely telling about the events, right? So this would be the difference between saying that I, let's see here. I was maybe saying something like instead of saying that my parents ended up taking me to the emergency room, you could say instead something like this: my parents and my brother loaded me into the van and strapped me in place. I groaned, oh, and they zoomed me off to the doctor's office. Something like that. So you actually want to tell somebody, but you want to show them what happened. Don't just tell us what happened. Show us what happened. Give interesting details and actions. Okay, paragraph divisions. Begin a new paragraph every time a speaker changes or a topic changes. So that can be the speakers changing. That's a straightforward one. You have seen that in books and stuff. Every time someone else starts speaking, then the paragraph changes. So that's an obvious one. But the one that's going to be a little tougher to know is, when are you supposed to start a new paragraph when you're just telling something in chronological order? And I've noticed as I've done this myself that this is actually kind of an intuitive thing where it's the action has kind of come to a pause or something, and you can kind of feel that it's time to go to a new paragraph. So make sure that you cut your action up in places where it feels right to do that. Okay, and number 5, transitional expressions. Help your reader follow the story's times, places, and activities by using words like again, also, before me, finally, in the first place, meanwhile, next, still, and then. See Unit 4 of the paragraph for more examples. These are signposts. And as you go out on the road and you navigate around, especially in a place that you don't know, you have to rely on signposts to be able to get you from one place to the other. Same thing is true when you're reading a story like this. It is super helpful to the reader if you put signposts up that say things like next, that shows that you're now moving to something else. Or meanwhile, that shows that something else was happening while something else was happening, right? So use signal words as signposts to tell people where you were, where you are now, and where you're going. Okay, and that's going to take us all the way up to step 5. Step 5 then is revise and rewrite the first draft. So all you're doing today is writing that first draft, and so we're going to go on to step 5 then on Monday. All right, so let's pull all the different loose strands together. Brainstorm. Brainstorm ideas. Set a timer for 5 minutes. Brainstorm. Pick a story and a theme that has been significant in your life. Number 2, write your thesis. What is the lesson you learned? That's your thesis. Number 3, organize your ideas in chronological order. Number 4, write your introductory paragraph. Use one of the attention grabbers that we discussed, and then write your thesis. Then next, write for paragraphs 2, 3, 4, however long it takes to get your story in. You're going to be telling your story in chronological order. And then number 3, your conclusion will be the final paragraph, and that conclusion is going to conclude the story, and it's going to sort of emphasize your thesis, emphasize the message that you're trying to tell. Okay, a couple things here. Make sure your story is at least 150, or this whole thing is at least 150 words long and consists of at least 3 paragraphs. Your introduction, your body, and your conclusion. So that would be like 50 words per paragraph. But once this is probably going to be one of the easier essays you may have ever written, because it's going to include you just telling a story. So I want to make sure make sure then that you use good grammar, good sentence structure, and good grammar, good sentence structure. Use complete sentences, and just overall do an excellent job in writing your body paragraphs, because you're going to be putting less thought into organizing it, so you can put more thought into making sure it's really, really well written. Okay, so that's going to be what is coming up for you today in grammar. That first draft needs to be turned in then by Monday at 8:30. Okay, that is all I've got for you guys. I hope you can stay safe, stay sane, stay inside, enjoy your weekend. I hope it's still sunny over the weekend. That would be fantastic. Mr. Chris, out.